All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our weekly client coaching call here at Podetize and Feed Your Brand. And I am your host for today. Tracy is traveling, not available. And I have a really fun topic for me anyway. It's a fun topic to talk about. Fun may be the wrong word, but it is a good topic, and it's been fun for me to re-explore it. I'm going to explain why I re-explored this topic, and I'm going to record this as an episode of my podcast, Feed Your Brand, for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions of anybody who is here live in Zoom, and we'll even, if people type some in from social media, because we're streaming to like 4 different social media platforms at the same time, we'll happy to answer some questions about this subject today or any other topic that you may have regarding, your podcast, want to help move you forward. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Let's see, hold on. I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar. At one point, I am going to share my screen briefly, but it's not going to be up for terribly long. I don't like doing that. I want to hide behind the slides. All right. So yeah, the subject will be obvious here as I start the episode. So let's see. Oh, I forgot we're already recording, right? I don't have to set that to record. All right, here we go. Actually, you know what? Before I do that, Cody, can you just type me in the chat, what's the official SEO title that we chose for this episode? I want to make sure I state it properly as I start it.
There you go.
Thank you. Of course, my camera is like right in the way of that.
This is part of your prep before you go into your recording. This is all good.
Yeah. And I didn't have, I knew what it was about and I'm prepped, but I didn't have the.
You want the SEO value in the
SEO
episode. Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Very good. Great. Here we go. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Feed Your Brand. I'm Tom Hazzard, your host. Today, I want to talk about a subject that I bet many of you seasoned podcasters would think, oh, I don't need to hear that. Why do we need to talk about that again? I understand it. And you might, but I'm willing to bet the vast majority of you, experienced podcasters and new podcasters alike, really have a common misunderstanding of Apple's explicit content guidelines. So what I want to talk about today is understanding Apple's explicit content guidelines to better categorize your show and to make sure your show actually is achieving what you want it to in terms of messaging, but also that you don't end up sort of in the crosshairs of Apple saying, hey, you know what? We're going to delist your show until you fix this. So let me get to it here. And I want to start actually by sharing that there's no official legal controlling authority over podcasts as a whole. Okay. And broadcast, television and radio, broadcasting in general, and I'm talking old school over the traditional airwaves. Now, most of us still listen to, at times, broadcast radio in our cars, especially, is probably the time most of us would do it. Whether that's satellite radio, it's governed by the same rules, or actually over the airwaves, FM, AM radio. The FCC really does strictly govern content that's broadcast live, because anybody with the right device can, have a battery operated device or plug in, put up an antenna, and you receive broadcast content. Same thing with television, although hardly anybody is really using, an antenna anymore, but you could. It's usually cable or satellite. But the FCC does govern those things. There are actual rules, and if, stations or broadcasters do not work within those rules, they can get fined and lose their license with the FCC. So there's a lot more specific consequences. And most people, when you think of explicit content or clean content, think of having a show that doesn't have any profanity in it, which is a reasonable thought and assumption to have. In the FCC, there's actually some hard and fast rules, and there is actually an official list of the 7 so-called dirty words that you are not allowed to say on any broadcast radio or television. And in fact, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but any of you that, grew up in the 80s and 90s and originally in, I would say New York or Washington, D.C., but even across the country, whoever listened to Howard Stern, or maybe you might have, seen the movie that came out about the early part of his career called Howard Stern's Private Parts. There's actually a very good scene in this movie where the legal department at WMDC in New York has a sit down with Howard about these rules and what they are and what those dirty words are and what he's allowed to do and not allowed to do according to the station. Of course, Howard, immediately after that, he and his crew sort of break those rules, or I would say bend them, stretch them as much as they can, and try to use some of those dirty words in a way that actually in context is allowed. It's a hilarious scene, and if you haven't seen that movie, I'd recommend you do it. In fact, in the blog post of this episode, I'm going to get a YouTube clip of that scene and put it in the blog post so you can go check it out there. Now, in the world of podcasting, as I said, there's no legal controlling authority, and there is no list of, words you cannot say. And in point of fact, as podcasters, independent podcasters, okay, now if you have a podcast that's being produced by a big corporation, you may be governed by a whole different set of rules. But the vast majority of you working with Podetize and listening to this podcast are independent podcasters, and you have the right to say whatever you want. Podcasting is absolutely a safe haven of free speech, and I love podcasting specifically for that. But there actually are important guidelines. While there's no broad controlling authority over all podcasts, there are individual listening apps. And as independent podcasters, we could publish things on our own website, don't have to censor anything, mark anything as explicit or whatever you want. You could publish whatever you want on the internet on your own website. But if you want your show to be available on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify and on iHeartRadio, each of these different apps, and there are, more than 24 listening apps out there and growing. There's always new ones. In fact, we just got some information in the last 24 hours. It was announced that TikTok has a new podcast app, or their app. You can now register your podcast to be distributed over TikTok. Now, I got to tell you, that news is so new. I don't have a lot to tell you about that, but that's going to be an upcoming Feed Your Brand episode as we dig into it and find it out. It's literally less than 24-hour old news that when I'm recording this or actually streaming this live to our community now. But the point is, each different listening app makes their own rules, their own guidelines, some better than others. And of course, the most important one is Apple. Apple invented this industry. Apple, in our experience as a podcast company, as a hosting platform, anywhere between 50 to 90% of a podcast show's plays on our platform are still coming from Apple, and we distribute people to every listening app possible and any listening app they want to be on, even if it's not one of the standard ones we would put it on. Your show can be on any and all listening apps. But Apple by far really makes the guidelines for the industry that everybody else really follows. And in fact, in researching for this episode to, find out what the current guidelines are, I found that very much to be the case. Apple's really the only one that defines content guidelines very well, somewhat specifically. I was about to say very specifically, but I stopped myself because there are no absolute rules. There's a lot of gray area. And here's where all of us podcasters really need to be aware of this. because we may think, oh, I don't use profanity in my show, so I don't have to mark my podcast as explicit. Well, I'm here to tell you, certainly if you have profanity in your episodes, you absolutely should mark your shows as explicit. But it's not just about swear words. It's just not about profanity. It's actually about much more than that. And it is a judgment call at the end of the day on the part of Apple. If they were to shut you down, if you don't mark your shows explicit and they think it should be. And then also it's on the part of the listener, because the only way Apple's going to know about it or hear about it is if somebody complains that your episode or your show should have been marked explicit, but it was not. And there are consequences for that. So what I'm going to do right now, for those of you listening to the podcast, you're not going to see this, but you can go to the blog post at podetize.com and you will see an image and a link to this. What I'm sharing right now on my screen for those on video is Apple Podcasts content guidelines. And they talk about what's really allowed and not allowed. And I'm going to go right to section 1.2. And this is a very short, this is literally one sentence, but there's a lot packed in it. It says, explicit content. Creators must flag individual episodes with the explicit tag if they contain explicit content. So it hasn't defined explicit content yet, but it's about to. In parentheses here, it says, for example, profanity. So that's pretty clear. Or content that may not be suitable for children. It's that last part that is the kicker that we all need to be aware of. And it is not further defined, I think, intentionally, so that Apple can go ahead and define that however they want. They reserve the right, by the way, to change these guidelines at any time. It's their app, their platform. Even if they want to change it and make decisions in a different way tomorrow, they can do it. They can update that policy. And in fact, that policy has so much wiggle room in it. You know, what is a word that is profanity and what is one that's not? I bet they have a list of words and it grows. But in other contexts, it's really more about, is it suitable for children? Now, that's certainly a judgment call, but I'm going to give you an example, because the reason I decided to record this episode, share it with our community of podcast listeners, and of course, it's being shared first with Podetize customers live through our various ways that we bring them content every week in our client-only coaching call. It caused me to, what caused me to look at this again is we have a customer who we produce episodes for that has what is a clean show, or they want it to be a clean show. That means no profanity, but more importantly, that means it's not marked as explicit. It is marked as clean. So my expectation as a parent is that I could play that episode on the speakers in the car, and I'm not going to have any content not suitable for children, so that when I'm listening to it, I, don't have my 8-year-old asking me a question about what does this mean, and I have to explain it. That's an adult subject or topic. I'm going to give you a very direct example and share with you what happened. So we have this podcast we produce. It's called How to Buy a Home with David Sidoni. Wonderful show. It is targeting first-time home buyers, especially millennials, and helping them move away from just paying rent to actually owning their own home and building equity and assets in their life, making them more financially healthy. Wonderful show, incredibly popular show, does very, very well nationwide. I mean, it's a fantastic show and a model for, local business person creating a podcast and blowing up their revenue and business using podcasting. So great example. Now, David's goal is to have a clean show. He doesn't want it marked explicit. So as a policy, we had some guidelines when we're editing his show. If there's profanity, we would bleep it out. But recently, David had an episode where he felt like too much was bleeped out. And part of what he was doing is, he's very talented in how he communicates. He's fun to listen to, and he injects humor into his show. And there was some humor that got lost because we bleeped out some content. And there are words that, especially in sort of modern vernacular slang, whatever you want to call it, when something's really cool, someone would call it bitchin', we hear that a lot. And that is something that, David would say, no, I don't, that's just, we're speaking freely. This is good content. I don't want that bleeped out, and that's fair. But then there was some other language that was used. And, David said to me in email, for example, the word pimp is not profanity. I don't want that bleeped out. So here's what I'm going to share with all of you and what I shared with David. It's like, you know what, as podcast producers and even as a publishing platform, we're not going to censor you. We're not going to make requirements. We're not going to be your conscience as to even whether you mark your show as explicit or not. That decision is yours, and we're not going to get in the way of that. But I am going to provide you with all the information necessary so you can make your own decision. Ultimately, here's the risk, okay? And I'm a good example. I mean, I've got everywhere from an adult child down to a child still in grade school. And if I'm listening to David's show in my car and the word pimp comes up, and my 8-year-old in the back seat, along with her friend who's often in our car, who's also 8 years old, if one of them says to me, "Daddy, what's a pimp?" Do I really want to have to explain that to an 8-year-old? I really don't. So if your show is marked explicit, I would have not listened to that show while I'm driving, these two 8-year-olds to their cheerleading practice. They are on a cheer team. Here in California, we have a lot of those things. I'm not going to listen to it while they're in the car. I'll wait till they're out of the car. That's what the explicit rating is for. It's meant to give me, the listener, often a parent, the option or the warning to say, hey, if you've got children, some of this content may not be appropriate for them, and you may not, you really don't want to listen to it when they can hear it. But if I don't have that warning, if the show is marked as clean and then I feel it's inappropriate, as a listener, I can reach out to Apple and say, hey, this show should be marked explicit. I had to explain this to my child, whatever. I mean, who knows what someone would write in their complaint. Apple has the absolute authority to take your show down until you either mark it explicit or bring your show into compliance with their guidelines from their perspective. They have to think, okay, now this show is within compliance, and then they can put your show back. Now, each different listening app will make their own decision on that, and it's not like they talk to each other. They don't. Again, this would take a person, a listener who is unhappy that you didn't mark your show as explicit, to reach out to that listening app and say, hey, you've got a problem with your content here, you need to fix it. So that's the risk. And you might, for your show, you might think, chances that happen are very slim. And they may be, but I sure would hate to see a podcaster have their show taken down for something like this just because they didn't mark their shows explicit, or they want to have a clean show, but they left some things in there that are borderline, that from one person's perspective could be deemed to be inappropriate for children, and another person's perspective, they might say, no, it's perfectly appropriate. I don't care if a child hears that. So that's really the big difference. Now, interestingly, as I researched this, and it's something, even though I've been podcasting for 10 years and I've understood the explicit rating for a long time, what I believed it to mean is pretty much in alignment with what it is today as I researched it. But I went to look at other apps, and I have to say I was kind of shocked with how other apps are really not addressing this issue. They're really leaving it up to Apple in many ways. And there are a lot of listening apps that are what I would call Apple clones that you don't even register your show on. Once you're on Apple, there's 8 or 10 other apps that pick up your show and make it available on their app. So when we syndicate shows, we don't actually have to go register it on all those apps. We do it on 14 or 15, and then a whole bunch more pick it up. So everybody ends up on, maybe 24-ish apps. But there are others, like I looked at Spotify, which is a very popular one. And I have to say, Spotify doesn't even address explicit content for the podcast creators. They only address it to the listeners, and their entire, mention of it and writing of it is less about providing guidance to those that are publishing content. It's really all about covering their rear ends, to not use a word that might be questionable, to really try to tell the listeners that, hey, we're doing our best to stay on top of this, but don't hold us responsible for the content. We're trying to allow artists, creators to express themselves, and you need to beware whether something is explicit or not, as a listener. They're basically saying, hey, don't complain to me. We're doing the best we can as a platform. We're trying to provide you with guidelines to know whether you want to listen to something privately or semi-publicly, in your car or other environment or not. So they're taking a different approach, which to me is kind of a more of a defensive position in trying to avoid liability or complaints with people. And Google Podcasts, who has, Google is a huge company. And what I realized is, even though Google Podcasts has their own listening app, they really showed me in my research that how little podcasts matter to them, because they're this huge company dealing with search content of the entire world's accumulated knowledge, and podcasts is one small drop in that bucket for them, maybe one small drop in an ocean for them. And they really talk about their policies, but it's really all built around search, and they mention podcasts, but it's really, they have all sorts of, they have recommended policies for podcasts, is what they say. Google Podcasts recommended policies, but they don't define explicit content at all. So they're really leaving that up to Apple, the big guys who invented podcasting. And I believe the whole industry is still following Apple. So my recommendation for all of you podcasters out there, whether you're starting a new one or you already have one out, is to use your own common sense and make a decision that you can live with. It depends on your sort of level of risk that you're willing to take, that, how likely do you think it is someone's going to be listening to your podcast in an environment where there may be children that would hear it or hear parts of it? And is the content of your show truly clean, meaning it's appropriate for children? Not only does it not contain profanity, but it doesn't contain mature subjects that children, parents would not want children to be hearing. And if it passes that test, then mark your whole show as clean, or, to put it another way, not explicit. However, if your show really on a regular basis does contain mature subjects or profanity, all you got to do is mark it as explicit, and that's it. As long as you mark it as explicit, you're fine. And in our research, marking a show as explicit does not reduce the number of people that are going to listen to your show. It really has no impact on that statistically from our experience. But let's say in general, you have a clean show, but you know what? You've got an episode once a year, once a quarter, that has a mature subject. Well, in case you didn't know, you can, with most hosting platforms, certainly on Podetize, you can mark a single episode as explicit within otherwise a clean show. So all of your different the vast majority of your episodes can be clean. You've got a mature subject. You mark that episode as explicit, and that's enough. That's in compliance. If somebody complains to Apple about it, they're going to say, well, but this episode is marked as explicit. You should not have played this in your car. That's on you, listener. It's not on us, nor is it on the content creator. That's the mechanism that's in place to do this. For good or bad, like it or don't like it, you can argue that it's not a great standard. And I think that's a fair criticism because there's a lot of wiggle room in it. So that's why I say, use your common sense, make a decision about your own show, then decide to mark it as explicit or not. And, as appropriate as you think it should be, and then live with that decision. I'm sure most of you will make a decision that is in alignment with what Apple would think if they were to get a complaint or look at your show and evaluate it. Not that they really evaluate shows for this specifically, but that's really it. Make your own decision, make sure you can live with it. We are not going to be your conscience. I think most hosting platforms are not. But when it comes to production, obviously, we're going to follow the guidelines of our client and how they want those shows to be edited, whether they want us to remove profanity, like cut it out in the editing process, or leave it in and bleep it out, or just make it silent. I mean, there's several different ways we handle that when we produce episodes. And if you're editing your own episodes, you can make your own decision on what works for you there. But remember, bleeping out words doesn't necessarily sanitize an episode from a discussion that's not appropriate from children. I guess that's maybe the biggest message I want to share with you today. It says less about a discussion of words, good and bad, appropriate or not. It's more, words are a part of it, but it's a broader evaluation that happens whether a show is appropriate for children to listen to it or not. All right. So that's it. That's what I want to share with you today. I hope you find it valuable. I will have the link for some of these different policies that I referred to, Apple, Spotify, Google, in the important links at the blog post for this episode on podetize.com. So, if you're listening to this podcast or watching this video, you can go there and get those references and read them for yourself and check them out. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be back next time with another great episode. I hope you'll enjoy. Until then, this is Tom signing off for Feed Your Brand. Okay. So I know we have some questions. I didn't want to derail. I sort of had a plan for that episode. I didn't want to stop and interrupt. So I am going to read if I have any quick question regarding popularity on Apple. Yeah. And I did get this question emailed in, forwarded to me, and truly I did do a little research on it, and I have been unable to find an answer to what that popularity. Anna's asking what the popularity bar in Apple means specifically. I mean, obviously that's an indication of how popular an episode is, but what does it mean? What is it based on? I don't have the answer for you on that yet. I don't know how you should interpret it. I'm going to have to get back to you on that. And I may have to reach out to our Apple contact specifically to get an answer to that, but I will. So that is on the agenda, so to speak. Cody, do we have any other questions or comments on social media?
None right now. I see a couple people are tuned in, so it looks like they're looking for the content, but I'm looking out for questions.
Okay, great. So, and this is a time now where any of you, and I want to welcome Rick Scher, who's new. Thank you for joining, and I hope you enjoy today's session here. And we do this every week. It's always a different topic, hopefully relevant to everyone. But now is the point where if you have a question, something you'd like to share, something you'd like to talk about, something you need support on, live here for me, and oftentimes it's me and Tracy, but she's traveling, so she's not here today. We're here to help you. Whatever you might have a question about does not have to be about today's subject of episode, explicit policy. So just understand that. You're also welcome to send questions to us into us ahead of time, which Anne, to be fair, did with her question. It's just by the time I saw it, it was late yesterday, and I did do a little research, but ran up against a sort of challenge or obstacle of not finding all the information out that I knew you'd be looking for. So it's going to take a little more digging. So I will get back to you on that. I found it really interesting, and sort of to go a little deeper on the whole thing with how to buy a home. I love David Sidoni's show. Any of you who are interested to see a show which is communicating a topic that is pretty, how do I say, it's a business related topic. I mean, I guess most people end up buying a home in their lives at some point. But he makes it really entertaining. He's a bit of a performer in a lot of ways, and it's a fun show. And so, he's trying to have humor. He's trying to make it entertaining, and he's appealing to a millennial audience. It's quite a bit younger than him. He's like, he's kind of my age, and has kids that are in high school type thing. And it's and really, when this issue came up with him, it really caused me to just sort of go back and check and make sure my understanding of all this was correct. And I realized, I bet there's a lot of people that misunderstand it. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Okay, Rick has a question. Sorry if you answered this already, but by market explicit, does that affect searchability or rank in lower in search? No, I can answer that with confidence. It does not impact the searchability of your show, and that it shows up in Apple. Okay, I do think Spotify has a couple different levels. I know because I read this. In Apple, it does not affect searchability, does not lower you in any search results, or even in popularity or climbing the charts in Apple. It has zero impact on that. So I know a lot of people felt like, oh, I don't want to mark my shows explicit because fewer people will listen to it if you think we're just going to swear left and right all day, all episode long. And that's, I could tell you after a decade of doing this, that just doesn't happen. Certainly not today. There may have been a time earlier on in the evolution of podcasts where an explicit rating had a certain stigma to it, but I really do not believe that exists today. There's audiences are a little more experienced and understand what it means. So I want to say, Spotify, if people bother to read, which I think is a very big if, okay, a very big if. Okay, thanks, Rick. Have a good meeting. They have a very big if, is that Spotify is providing listeners different ways to filter content for them to listen to, and they have a couple different levels of ways you can search for things that are only clean. But a few things I want to share on that. Spotify, as much as they are trying to be a very big listening destination for podcasts, I can tell you from a data perspective, are really not as big as people think they are. A lot of new podcasts come to us and say, oh, I need to be on Spotify first, and they want to drive all their listenership to Spotify, which it's their perfect right to do if they want to. But we know there's far more listeners listening in Apple Podcasts than there are on Spotify. I mentioned, 50 to 90% of listens is what we see coming on Apple. Spotify often is number 2, but it is a distant number 2. I mean, a single digit percentage of listenership, and not the highest single digit numbers usually. So anyway, they have ways that if the informed Spotify listener or user uses their app properly, they can search for content that is only clean if they want to. So that sort of goes back to Rick's question before he had to leave the meeting, and hopefully you'll see this on the replay, or on the recording. But the reality is, in Apple, there is no way to search for family friendly content only. So there you go. That was a good question though. Let's see.
Nothing on the socials right now.
Nothing on social. So Cody, is your show explicit or not?
Yes, actually, my show it's marked as explicit for the entire platform. I don't do it by episodes. But it was really neat to hear, especially because Podetize lets you do this. You can mark specific episodes as explicit. So like, let's say, for instance, David accidentally uses one of those borderline should a kid hear this word type of thing. He doesn't need to mark his entire show as explicit, but can do just an individual episode. That's really good information to hear. But yeah, my show is explicit. It's very explicit. So
and that's okay.
Have fun listening to that. I mean, the whole point is we're having, fun discussions, and we want to break the critique barrier, such an informative type of way. We want to try to give our own unique individual opinion. And when we're talking about movies and such, there's themes in movies as well too that you can't just necessarily talk about on a regular podcast without marking that stuff explicit as well too. Like, for instance, we just reviewed the Billy Eichner movie that just came out recently called Bros, and there's a lot of big huge themes in that has to do with male to male partners and all that stuff as well too. So there's a lot of things that we go into on a couple different topics with different movies. So, and this week we just dropped an episode about Quentin Tarantino as well too. So
yeah, I can imagine that one, how that one is. Yeah, and the way I would say it is, it's really hard to talk around certain mature subjects in a clean way that's going to be appropriate. Again, appropriate for children. That's the lens that they're looking through. And the other thing that I've experienced with guests on my show.
Okay.
Tracy and I have each interviewed a lot of guests over the last 10 years. And I will tell you, even though it's not Tracy's and my style to have an explicit show or to need to have one, to use, adult language, we may talk about some mature subjects. Rarely. Actually, I think at one point in our 3D printing podcast, Tracy and I talked about 3D printed guns.
Oh, okay.
And I think that one strayed over into something I really don't want my kids to be listening to be worried about guns in school, or to learn about some of these mass shootings we talked about and stuff like that. So we marked that episode explicit.
Okay, that was a good move.
But what that I sort of got off on a tangent there, because I really meant to talk about guests. What will happen is we've interviewed a lot of guests, and we would normally it'd be clean discussion, but you'll get a guest whose language they use is just not in alignment with yours.
Sure.
And you'll all of a sudden they're dropping F-bombs here or there, and speaking in a way that was just very different from what you would normally do. And you've got to decide, as a podcaster, are you gonna cut that out? Are you gonna bleep it? Because what you don't want to do is say, "Oh, I'm sorry, can you say that again? We don't use that kind of language on our show." You don't really want to do that with a guest, because you're going to take them completely out of the headspace they're in of delivering some kind of valuable message to your listener. So I don't recommend doing that. To me, it more becomes a post-production decision after it's recorded. What are you going to do? You're going to air that unfiltered, unedited, and put an explicit rating on it, or are you gonna clean it up? And can you even, I think you have to ask yourself, can you even clean it up enough that it wouldn't be, such a problem. You know, it's kind of funny. I remember, I think what's very important in this subject is for everyone to really think about another important word, and that's perspective.
Perspective. Yeah.
It really, because and when we're in our own worlds, in our own environments, in our own podcast show world or work environment or home environment, we have things that we experience every day that seem normal and acceptable to us.
Yeah.
But until someone outside of that environment or situation experiences it, we don't necessarily realize how it might appear to others. It sort of holds a mirror up to us. And I remember, I can tell you at one point, this is going back a long time. It's like 20 plus, more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
I briefly worked for another company as an employee, and I had a boss who was the really stereotypical, you know, the language he used, you would say he sweared like a truck driver. I mean, that's what you would say. I mean, every other word out of this guy's mouth was profane, and it was just the way he talked. And, you know, you eventually you get sort of numb to it and you don't even realize it.
Sure.
And my sister, who was a school teacher for grade school children in Colorado, came to visit and, you know, got delivered from the airport to my place of work. And I had her just, you know, sit in my office for the last half hour of the day. Then when I was driving her home to my house for the weekend, whatever we're doing. And my boss, you know, comes in and is talking to me the way he normally would. And he's not like yelling at me. He's just talking about something. And her eyes are lighting up. And then later she says, oh my gosh, he dropped a lot of F-bombs there. It's like, oh yeah, this isn't grade school. This is, I mean,
that's my boss.
I can't control him. And, you know, that's just the way he talks. And, you know, she was actually understanding of it. But anyway, the point is perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even though your intended audience for your show, you might think, well, I'm not a show that is for soccer moms who are going to be driving a bunch of kids in a carpool.
Sure.
Well, guess what? I'm not a soccer mom, and I drive a carpool once a week. Oh, yeah. Speaking of, I drive it in a couple hours today.
Yes, you do.
So, you know, and I listen to all sorts of topics. So, you know, and if there are kids in the car, I'm not going to do it if it's explicit. Or if I have any concern that it might be explicit, even if it's not labeled that way. But
yeah.
Now we have to trust the labels, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so you want to make sure that you keep yourself safe as well too. Now, to go back to the guest portion, because you can't really predict what a guest is going to say all the time. Is there something that you can do in your vetting process to kind of let them know, hey, these are the values of my show, and we want to stay away from certain topics or something like that? Is that something you could do in that vetting process, or do you want to just take it to post-production, as you said earlier?
I think you have every right as a podcaster to set proper expectations for your guest. And we, you know, that's a good point, Cody. I'm glad you brought it up. We do recommend you email your upcoming guests after they book a time with you, to then you know, prepare them for what to expect.
Yeah.
And in that, you certainly could say either we require or we strive to, or something, have a clean show. So please try to keep that in mind, and don't use any profanity, you know, or we would prefer you don't use any. I mean, it depends. How far do you want to go? Do you want to toe a hard line? Some people do, and it's your show. You have every right to do it.
Sure.
So again, judgment call, personal preference. But yes, I think if you really don't want to have to edit anything out, you don't want to have to mark an episode as explicit, and the topics you talk about, while they probably would be of no interest to children,
sure,
would not be inappropriate. Like you could talk about tax accounting, in a podcast, and that's
Yeah.
kids are like, what's tax accounting? Oh, something you learn about when you're an adult. Don't worry about it.
Mhm.
No big deal, no harm, no foul, right? But as long as you're not talking about a true mature subject, like I know one of the trending topics the last 4 months in podcasting has been the Dobbs decision on Roe versus Wade by the Supreme
Oh,
Court.
really?
So there's a lot of discussion about
Yeah.
abortion. Do I have to explain to my 8-year-old what abortion is? No,
Not right
not
now.
appropriate for an
No.
8-year-old. At some
Yeah.
point, it will something that child will learn about, as everybody eventually does.
Sure.
But it's so, but you're right. You can set up expectations for listeners and listeners, for guests, and
yeah.
most of them I believe will respect that,
Okay.
even if it's not their style.
Sure.
But again, these are own personal decisions. I mean, I know some people have criteria for guests on the show. Tracy has criteria for the binge factor. If you don't meet certain criteria, and it's not the same type of thing, it's not about the language you use, but if you don't meet certain criteria, you won't be on the show. So there is a vetting process she goes through with binge factor guests or prospective guests. Yes.
Okay, cool. Because I would like think that could be added as part of your process. That way we don't accidentally run into the stopping them in the middle of the recording or figuring out what to do with the post-production process. But it really seems like it's really all up to the host to kind of break the barrier, to let the listener know, hey, we have a certain theme in this episode. And the easiest way to do that is to just simply mark it as explicit, or, cut it out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, though, there are choices, and I'm glad that there's no sort of podcast police that are, nobody policing all this stuff. I love that podcasting is a safe haven of free speech.
It is.
And key to that is the choice people are making to listen or not. We're not putting this out over airwaves that people are randomly tuning into, and you're going to hear something you didn't expect. No.
We're not pirate radio.
People have to go seek out content, choose to listen to it, and click play to get it. That's an entirely different kind of listening experience, user experience. And I think podcaster has a right to say whatever they want and to foster whatever kind of content they want to on their show. We make no judgments on that. But the listening apps have their own rules they're allowed to make. They're private listening apps. You don't have to use their app. So they're going to each make their own rules, and that's okay. It's the way it is. But your website certainly is a safe space for you to publish whatever you want there. Content, even if a listening app didn't want it.
Sure. And it's funny because we have an explicit website as well too, but the words we use the asterisk in certain words for things, like for our bio on the heading, it's who the are we anyway, but we're using asterisks to block that out a little bit. It's just we're really upfront trying to show you, hey, this is an explicit show. So this is a couple tactics that we're trying to do to showcase, so that we don't get in trouble about, like, it's very clear that we talk about certain things, we use certain language on this show. Listen at your own risk,
Yeah, just be aware of what is coming and don't be surprised. And and it's really, I would call it a more of a decent warning system.
Sure.
So there you go. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. If there's no more on social media, let's
none right now.
Wrap it up. It's about 10 minutes before the top of the hour. Want to thank everybody who attended live and contributed to the discussion, asked questions, and any of you that are watching later on recording, feel free to reach out with any questions. Be happy to cover it, next week as soon as we can, or sooner, depending on the question. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.